Okay, so welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Pretty crowded here. So I'm glad that you're all here. I want to talk about actually the 7 sins of workflow and rules. I wanted to do that in 45 minutes, and then I think I was too late, and they said, okay, you get 15 minutes, and I said, okay, I can do 15 minutes, but I skip the rules and I do 3 things. So I'm sorry about that, but that's what you get in the 15 minutes. And I wanted to start what is workflow. I'm not sure. Does anybody already working with the workflow engine? Only a couple of you, okay. So sometimes you also know that as business process management or business processes. Currently, I prefer the term workflow, but it's really a preference. So it's normally you're talking about the same thing. And if you're talking about that, it could be, for example, this very easy process. That's BPMN. BPMN is a standard for modeling processes. So that has at the beginning a start event. And say, for example, I want to have vacation, so I have a vacation requested. Then I have a so-called user task. So there's something to do, something I want to put on a task list for somebody because maybe my boss has to approve the vacation. Then there's this so-called gateway with the X. It's a so-called XOR gateway. I go either the one way or the other. So I have the engine decides, depending on the input I gave when I approved it. So if I approved it, I move on. Otherwise, I end the process instance. And then I have that service task where I call some kind of service, however I do that. Then, for example, I have the timer event just to show what you can do in BPMN. So I basically wait some time, for example, and then I call another service. So that's more or less what a workflow can do. And I very often show that vacation request example, and I'm actually very sorry to show that because it's, I'm not sure if you say that in Sweden. In Germany you say it has a very long beard because it's kind of an old example. It's not what the people are doing out there with workflow. So that's important from my perspective to know. So if you're doing workflow, it's normally not vacation request. If you're taking care about vacation, you're using a tool for that, Absence.io or something like that. That's what we use. I don't code a workflow for that. But the people are doing these kind of workflows on a bigger scale with more complex examples. So these are just a couple of screenshots from various customers we have. So for example, above one, if you want to have a credit card as a certain bank, you run through that process, like the credit card gets approved, certain checks, and that at the end it gets issued and sent to you. So that could be a workflow. Or the one down here is like it's claim handling at an insurance. So I drop my phone and I want to get it paid. Then I basically start here and then I walk through that process over time. Or in the middle, that's if I want to have a new DSL line at a certain telecommunication company, then you run through this process. So these are business processes normally handled by these workflow engines. So it's not vacation request. That's important from my perspective. But the vacation request is nice in order to explain it because it's a very easy one and it already contains what even the big processes contain as well. So you have that human task management, so task lists. You want to involve people. You have that, okay, decisions, for example, the gateways. You have service orchestration, so you want to call some service of some kind. You have the timers like events, or you want to wait for messages. So these are things you already see in the vacation request. And for example, it could also be if you call a system which is not synchronous, like a REST API, you might also use messaging, so then it gets asynchronous, and that also involves some kind of waiting for events. And that's actually what you have as a challenge when you want to implement workflow. And these we call that long-running processes. So all of that means that this is a long-running process because you have to wait for a human, you have to wait for a message, you might have to wait for some certain time. So that might take from a couple of hours to a couple of days to a couple of months. And that means it's long-running. Long-running means you definitely have to keep state. You have to keep state somewhere. And as soon as you start keeping state, which might be very easy in the beginning, you have an order table with an enum where it said the order is placed, the order is paid. So that's already kind of a workflow state. But as soon as you start having that, you have additional requirements, like you want to have a view on the eye, an eye on the time, you want to have escalation, you want to have monitoring, and these kind of things. So these are challenges you have as soon as you implement workflow. And the other thing, it's more, maybe not a necessity, but you want to have visibility. So everything we do with workflow means we want to have something visible. We want to see the process. We want to discuss it maybe in the analysis phase, but we also want to see it in operation. So where are we stuck? Where are problems? What's the current state of that workflow? So there's a lot of things about visibility you want to have. So that's basically the introduction. So I promised the 7 sins, and I show you the 7. I only talk about 3 of them today. If you're interested in the other ones, approach me later, so there's enough time here to discuss them, but don't do that today. And that already brings me to the first sin, which is basically not using an engine. So I'm basically biased because we're doing an open source engine, so I have to say that. But what in my personal career, I do workflow for around 10 years now, and I see a lot of applications being built without an engine. And that normally means you keep the state, what I said earlier, and like an integer, and you build some whatever, like a timer EJB in order to check if that's overdue, and you have some date timestamps here and there, you have some triggers doing this and that, and it's really a mess. To understand how the process is working in the background. And nowadays we have a lot of requirements for changing processes very fast, and then it's really hard to see where I have to change something. And the best example is what I named as an anti-pattern, the alarming, but I called it management attention. I had that in my very first project. It was a telecommunication company, and they had this DSL fixed line order process, hard-coded, and then that basically went down because we had a problem with that. But we didn't recognize, and we recognized it because on Monday, basically the CEO saw in the sales figures there was no DSL line sold over the weekend, and normally it's like 2,000 or 3,000 new applications a day. So he saw that figure went down to 0, approached the CTO, and then basically that went down to all of head of offices, head of departments, and all of them approached us in the office and said, hey, why is that not working? And we had no idea, and that's not how it should be. So you should have kind of an engine, and that these engines, I mean, not only ours, all of them basically can do something like like incident handling, where you see, okay, this process is stuck. It's exactly at that point. With that arrow message, and you normally can leverage that also in alarming, like in Nagios or in Singa or whatever you have, in order to really do proper alarming. So that's something you should leverage, actually. Most projects actually recognize that. So they start with no engine, they start to build something, and then they recognize, okay, that's not enough. But we don't need a workflow engine. That's so complex, that's overhead. So we start developing our own. I see that once a month, I would say. An homegrown engine. It's always the same story. It starts very small, very easy. We don't need that full-fledged engine. And at the end, it means normally, I see that very often, that you start to build your own DSL. Very often with graphical interfaces, very, very exciting what they build, but it's a lot of effort. And it's not standard-based, not that BPMN I showed earlier. And then you recognize, I have my DSL, I want to have a graphical representation. Oh, I have to parse that. Oh, I have to model that. Oh, I have to take care about the persistence, about the escalation, about the timing. So there are a lot of things you start adding there, and that just gets too much effort. And it's always the same thing. And then you have whole teams. I know a customer, they have a team of 6 people just maintaining the internal engine, and that always lags behind. You never will reach something like the open source engines or the commercial tools can do out there, and that's nothing you want to do. So I strictly do not recommend that. The next thing is maybe harder to catch, but I already talked today to a couple of people who experienced that in the past, and we call that the zero code suites. So a lot of the big vendors have BPM products where the idea is you do business processes, workflows without any coding, without any developers. So they basically sell that idea to the management because it's easy to sell. They say, okay, you don't need that. IT, it's slow, it's expensive, they don't build what you want, so just do it yourself. And that obviously doesn't work because if you think about the processes I showed earlier, like order management, claim management, credit card issuing, these are core processes of your company. They're very complex. You have to involve a lot of IT systems, so it's not anything you can easily click together. And that normally ends up in the zero code suite handed over to IT, to the developers. And they are normally hated. I saw that a couple of times because you have to add some code and some weird properties panel. We call that death by properties panel. So please enter the code here. You don't have any code completion, but hey, you can enter code there. It's our own language, but hey, you can learn that. Or what they always do, I just Googled for BPM Suites, so I got this one, because I don't want to blame any vendor. You see that all these circles, so what a BPM Suite normally brings is like everything, user management, version control, own development approach, and a lot of things, and I think that's a very wrong approach, because if that ends up in IT, you normally don't like it, so I hear very often we have problems with the solution. What's normally meant is I really hate it. I literally hate that solution. It totally sucks. And normally it ends up in being BPM is kind of crap, which is not true. And this is why we are there, what we do different. So I haven't said who I am. I'm Bernd Rücker. I'm one of the founders of Camunda. We're a small company, or rather small. We're 60 people by now. I still say small company because I started it. When we started, we were 2 people. So we're located in Germany, in Berlin, and what we do is an open source workflow engine, and the idea is very different to what the big vendors are doing. So what we have in the core is an engine. It's a Java engine, so it's a main dependency. It's a jar. Nothing very complicated. We rely on a relational database, could be basically anything, but we need the database. And then you can use the Java API, or we have a REST API around that, so you can also talk via REST with the engine. And we have a couple of tools, like, for example, a task list where you can see all the tasks, or Cockpit, where you see the whole state of the engine, what's currently, where I have incidents, what's the current state of the instances. We have a graphical modeler for all the BPMN files, and so on and so on. But the important thing is, in the core, it's still a Java engine, so you could do something like this. This is working code, and I switch to the demo in a second. So you just say, okay, I want to have a process engine configuration. I just use, for example, an in-memory H2 database, and then I build the engine. Everything I need, and then I can communicate with the engine via a couple of services. And for example, I could deploy a BPMN process. That's the one you had graphically earlier. In the background, it's just an XML file. I can deploy it. And then, for example, I can just start new instances. That's it. So it's very easy to use. It's very easy to do, actually. I quickly show that. So I have the same thing here. So what I did as a demo is I have a short BPMN process, very, very easy to be honest. I just started. I call a rule set. So I skipped rules. It was in the title, so I said I added to the demo. What we use in order to do rules, it's so-called DMN. So we have decision tables. That's another standard. DMN, it looks like that. I hope it's self-explaining. So I said I have some inputs, so the conference I am, and then the greeting is determined by the rule table. So I actually had to look it up, but I hope it's correct. Yeah, Google didn't trick me. Okay, that's great. And then I get that greeting, and I basically, the service task, what we can do, same thing, very Java developer friendly. I can just add Java code to it, and that basically just prints it out on the console. So that's the hello world and the BPMN and DMN world. And then I can just do something like what you had on the slide. I deploy it, I run it, I enter JFocus, and if I run it, I should see that correct greeting in the background. Oh, what's happening there? That's the old Eclipse track. Give me a second. Yeah, 1 minute is enough to run that. Oh no, what's the problem now? Project. I did a clean, right? JFocus. What did I do wrong here? That's maybe the problem. Run as Java application. Why did he ask me? Okay, sorry, guys. I don't want to invest a minute in that. It puzzles me, though. Anyway, so you would have seen that great hello world there. Anyway. And there's much more. That's the interesting part. So at workflow, so for example, for Camunda, it means we also can write automated test cases, JUnit. We have an own assertion API. We can, oh, I'm out of time. How, now you get in my face, you said. Now I'm really interested in that. So there are a lot of other things. If you're interested, we have that poster at the booth. We have a lot of customers visit us, so that's the best thing, I think, to do. Then we can also discuss the other details. We are two floors upstairs in the booth. See you later, I hope. Thank you.